2:28 in the morning. That is the timestamp produced by Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker, a medical device embedded in her chest, transmitting cardiac data automatically to an application on her phone. On February 1st, 2026, at 2:28 in the morning, that connection dropped entirely, not because the battery died, not because of a software error, because Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, in constant pain, dependent on daily heart medication, unable to walk more than a few dozen yards on her best days, was no longer in range of her own phone. That timestamp is the most forensically clean data point in the entire investigation. It is independent of any human account. It cannot be shaped by memory or interpretation. It simply records the moment the signal stopped. 66 days later, no one has been arrested. No suspect has been named publicly. The $1.2 million combined reward from the family and the FBI remains entirely unclaimed. And the agency leading the investigation is simultaneously fighting a no-confidence vote from its own deputies, a board-compelled deposition of its sheriff, a recall effort requiring over 120,000 signatures, public accusations from a former United States Surgeon General that the crime scene was corrupted beyond recovery, and the revelation that the lead investigative team assigned to this case had no prior homicide experience. Those two facts, the pacemaker timestamp anchoring, one of the most carefully planned abductions in recent Arizona history, and the institutional collapse of the department supposed to solve it, are the story that no single broadcast has told in full. This video is going to tell it. Before any analysis, before any examination of evidence or process, there is a person at the center of this story who deserves to be recognized as exactly that. Nancy Ellen Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She was 84 years old. She had lived in the Tucson area for more than 5 decades. She raised 3 children after her husband Charles died during a mining exploration trip in Mexico in 1988, leaving her a widow at 46. She was known in her community for her deep faith, her weekly online church service, her love of her family, and the kind of quiet, consistent presence that people describe only when it is gone. She is not a headline. She is not a missing person case number. She is someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone's friend who showed up every Sunday morning for a live-streamed church service without fail. Until the Sunday she didn't. That Sunday, that absence, is what started everything. If you want to follow a case like this with the depth and precision it deserves, click the subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. This channel examines what the documented record actually shows, not what the official statements claim, and not what the speculation suggests. New investigations every week. And leave a comment right now. 66 days in with no arrest and a former sheriff calling the crime scene corrupted. Do you believe this investigation can still produce a conviction? Tell Emma below. Let's establish the timeline precisely, because precision is everything in a case where the distance between what was known and what was done in those first critical hours may have already determined the outcome. January 31st, 2026. A Saturday evening. Nancy left her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood just north of Tucson at 5:32 in the afternoon, taking an Uber to her daughter Annie's house for dinner and games, an ordinary family Saturday. The Uber driver who made that trip was subsequently interviewed by investigators, confirmed publicly by the sheriff, though the details of that interview have never been released. Nancy spent the evening with Annie, Annie's husband Tommaso Cioni, and her son Cameron. She was driven home by family at approximately 9:45 to 9:48 that evening. The garage door opened. 2 minutes later, it closed. That was the last confirmed moment anyone outside her home knew she was inside it. At 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, the Ring doorbell camera at the front of the property disconnected. Not because it malfunctioned, because someone was already at the front door. At 2:12 in the morning, a separate security camera at the property detected motion. At 2:28, the pacemaker signal dropped. The abduction window, anchored by that medical device, was complete. Her phone was still in the house. Her purse was still in the house. Her medication was on the counter. Nobody outside that home would know anything had gone wrong for nearly 14 hours. At 11:56 the following morning, a church friend noticed Nancy had not appeared for their weekly online service. She contacted the family. Annie and Cameron Guthrie went to their mother's home. They were on the property, inside the house, searching it for approximately 1 hour before anyone dialed 911. That call came in at 12:03 in the afternoon. Deputies arrived at 12:15, 12 minutes after the call. Somewhere between 45 minutes and 1 full hour after the family had first walked through the front door. Stop and hold that sequence for a moment, because it is the foundation of everything that has gone wrong in this investigation. The family arrived at a property where blood was visible on the front doorstep. The Ring camera had been physically yanked from the wall, and the back doors of the house were propped open. Those 3 details, confirmed publicly by Savannah Guthrie in her first interview since the disappearance, her March 26th conversation with Hoda Kotbon today, were the details that told the family something was catastrophically wrong. But they had already been inside that house for up to an hour before the police arrived. And in criminal investigation, that hour is not recoverable. The integrity of a crime scene is not a procedural formality. It is the foundation on which every prosecution is built or broken. Every object that is moved, every surface that is touched, every door that is opened by a person who is not wearing evidence gloves and following forensic protocol becomes a variable that cannot be controlled, cannot be documented after the fact, and cannot be undone. It does not matter how innocent those people are. It does not matter how cooperative or how devastated. The protocol exists precisely because evidence does not discriminate between the guilty and the grieving. You either preserve it or you do not. And in this case, law enforcement did not have first contact with that crime scene. The family did. Savannah Guthrie described the family's thinking in those first minutes with painful clarity. They processed the scene through the lens of an innocent explanation first. They thought Nancy might have had a medical episode in the night, that paramedics had come and taken her out the back on a stretcher. They looked for that explanation, and then they saw the blood, and then they understood. By the time deputies arrived at 12:15, the scene had already been psychologically and physically processed by people who had, through no fault of their own, been looking for a different story. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, analyzing those propped back doors, argued they most likely indicate perpetrators entered through the rear and left the doors open either for their own exit route or to allow additional access to the property. Retired NYPD Detective Michael Alcazar suggested the propped door signals multiple perpetrators rather than a single actor working alone. Both of those analyses are built entirely on Savannah Guthrie's public description of what her family found, because that is the only account of what those doors looked like in those first critical hours. Law enforcement did not observe them independently. The investigators who walked in at 12:15 were walking into a scene that had already been described to them by the people who arrived first. Now, let's talk about the ransom framework, because this is where the pattern of first contact and first framing becomes not just a forensic question, but an investigative one with consequences that have shaped this entire case. In the hours after Nancy was reported missing, while investigators were still processing the scene, Savannah placed a phone call to her brother Cameron. He already had a theory. Savannah confirmed this in her March 26th interview. In her own words, even on the phone when she called him, he said he thought their mother had been kidnapped for ransom. Before a note had arrived, before investigators had publicly characterized what they were dealing with, before the sheriff had held a single press conference, the family had already named the theory. And that theory communicated to investigators from the first hour of their involvement, became the frame through which every subsequent development was interpreted. 2 days after Nancy was reported missing, on February 3rd, the first ransom note arrived. It came not to the family directly, but through a tip submission system at local television station KVOA. TMZ received a copy the same day. A second communication arrived at KVOA on February 6th from a different IP address, but using similar anonymizing software. Both notes contained details about the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home that had not been publicly released. The specific location of her Apple Watch, the details of a floodlight inside the house. Information that, at the time those notes arrived, only someone with access to the interior of that property would have known. FBI Special Agent in Charge Keith Janke confirmed the Bureau was taking at least one note seriously because it included facts tied to a deadline and a demand for funds in Bitcoin. TMZ's Harvey Levin, who received a copy of the first note, described its level of specificity as striking, noting that the Apple Watch detail referenced where the watch was located, not in a place you would immediately think to look. On February 7th, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron stood together in an Instagram video and addressed whoever was holding their mother directly. They said they had received the message. They said they understood. They said they would pay. In doing so, the family publicly validated the ransom framing before law enforcement had formally confirmed even a single note as legitimate. Here is what the official record has never resolved. No agency has ever publicly confirmed whether those notes came from Nancy's actual captor or from someone with insider knowledge of the home who was not directly involved in the abduction. That distinction is not technical. It is the difference between a genuine proof of life negotiation and a misdirection that has consumed the investigative bandwidth of one of the most high-profile missing persons cases in recent American history. Former FBI Special Agent Harry Trumbull told Yahoo News that the ransom hypothesis looks less and less likely as time passes. There are too many ways kidnappers get caught in a genuine ransom operation. Too many digital traces, too many points of contact. Multiple former FBI agents have noted that the complete absence of any confirmed direct communication between the alleged captor and the family. No channel established, no proof of life delivered to the family rather than to media outlets is not a feature of how ransom kidnappings typically operate. It is an anomaly, and yet the ransom framework has remained the dominant investigative and public center of gravity in this case. Partly because the family named it first and has continued to publicly affirm it. At no point does any of this suggest family guilt. Sheriff Nonos officially and publicly cleared the entire Guthrie family, all siblings and all spouses, as possible suspects on February 16th. His statement was unambiguous. The family has been nothing but cooperative and gracious and are themselves victims in this case. The DNA recovered from inside Nancy's home does not match her or anyone in what Nonos described as close contact to her. The family is not guilty. That is settled. What is not settled is whether the investigative framework they introduced, under understandable conditions of panic and grief, was ever formally stress-tested rather than simply confirmed by evidence gathered within its own assumptions. That question is no longer being raised only by online analysts. It is now the public position of someone who ran this department. On March 27, 2026, Dr. Richard Carmona appeared on News Nation's Brian Entin Investigates. Carmona served as the 17th Surgeon General of the United States. He spent 3 decades with the Pima County Sheriff's Department. He led its SWAT team. He ran this agency. He knows exactly how crime scenes are supposed to be processed in this specific jurisdiction. And what he said on that broadcast is the most direct public rebuke of a sitting sheriff's investigative conduct that anyone with his credentials has offered in this case. Carmona told Entin that what alarmed him most, what he said perplexed all of us in the law enforcement community, was the moment Sheriff Nonos personally announced on television that he had opened the crime scene at Nancy Guthrie's Catalina Foothills home. That is not something a sheriff does. Carmona said it is the lead detective on the scene who makes that determination after confirming that all evidence has been photographed, bagged, tagged, and documented. A sheriff announcing the reopening of an active crime scene on television is not standard practice. It is a breach of the procedural separation that exists specifically to prevent command-level decisions from contaminating forensic-level work. Nonos then closed the scene again for further investigation. Carmona's assessment of that reversal was direct. Once it has been corrupted, that is the end of it. You cannot reconstitute a crime scene. Carmona also addressed the footage that had circulated showing a Domino's delivery car crossing Nancy Guthrie's front lawn while the active investigation was underway. His point was not about the delivery driver. His point was about courtroom admissibility. If you are going to court and making a case, he said, a defense attorney points to that and tells the jury the crime scene was corrupted. You had people delivering pizzas. How do we know this evidence is real? You cannot reconstitute a crime scene. Once it has been corrupted, that is the end of it. He went further. Nonos reportedly sent physical evidence not to the FBI laboratory for analysis, but to a private laboratory in Florida, citing cost savings. Carmona's response was precise. Federal forensic services are provided to local agencies at no charge. The FBI has the best forensic laboratory in the world, and it costs local departments nothing, because the funding comes from federal tax dollars. Choosing a private Florida lab over the FBI in a case where the FBI is simultaneously one of the lead investigating agencies is not a budget decision. It is the kind of institutional inconsistency that, in Carmona's words, defense attorneys exploit to challenge evidence chains in court. These criticisms did not emerge in isolation. They arrived in the context of an institutional collapse that has been building inside the Pima County Sheriff's Department for weeks. On March 24, 2026, the Pima County Deputies Organization, representing more than 300 members of the Sheriff's Department, voted on a motion of no confidence against Nonos. The result, 241 deputies voted for no confidence and immediate resignation. 65 abstained. Not a single deputy voted to express confidence in their sheriff and support his continuation. Not one. The same reporting that prompted the vote revealed that Nonos had resigned from the El Paso Police Department in 1982, 2 years earlier than listed on his public resume, to avoid termination over disciplinary issues including excessive force, insubordination, and off-duty gambling. He had been suspended 8 times in 3 years for a cumulative total of 37 days. The Sheriff's Department attributed these discrepancies to clerical errors. The Pima County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously shortly after to compel Nonos to answer questions under oath, invoking a territorial-era state statute that could create a legal pathway to his removal from office. Pima County Supervisor Matt Hines told Newsweek that Nonos had betrayed the trust that the community placed in him. Separately, a Pima County Sheriff's deputy was arrested and fired on a kidnapping charge unrelated to the Guthrie case. The department declined to confirm whether that deputy had played any role in the Guthrie investigation. Sources speaking to NewsNation confirmed that the investigative team assigned to the Guthrie disappearance had no prior homicide case experience, and the initial assessment in those critical first hours, before crime scene investigators had even arrived, was that Nancy had simply wandered off. A source told NewsNation there was an immediate rush to that judgment that investigators stayed with it and ran the early stages of the investigation as a search and rescue operation rather than as a potential criminal matter. That framework costs time, and in abduction cases, time is not a commodity that can be recovered. Now let's look at what the independent forensic record actually contains, what exists in this case that did not come filtered through an account the family provided. The FBI, working with Google, recovered footage from the Ring doorbell camera after investigators in the initial hours were unable to access it themselves. The device had been physically yanked from the wall, but the data it had captured was stored in Google's cloud servers. The footage, once recovered, showed a real person at Nancy Guthrie's front door. A man wearing a black ski mask, black gloves, and a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker backpack. A pack sold at the time of the investigation exclusively through Walmart. He approached the door, covered the camera lens with his gloved hand, then gathered shrubbery from nearby and propped it in front of the lens to obstruct the view more completely. He was carrying a firearm in an unusual center-waist holster position that analysts have specifically flagged as a distinguishing characteristic, different from the way law enforcement or military personnel are trained to carry. The FBI's forensic analysis places his height at approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, average build. There is a second image in the released footage, one in which the backpack and firearm are absent. The investigation has indicated this image was likely captured on a different day, which means the suspect visited Nancy Guthrie's front door more than once before the night of her disappearance. Former Pima County homicide detective Kurt Dabb told Parade that the level of operational planning evident in that footage, the full backpack, the armed entry, the prior surveillance visits strongly indicated advanced reconnaissance. His assessment, burglars do not go to burglarize a house with a full backpack. This was a kidnapping. Law enforcement has also confirmed to CNN that investigators believe the suspect may have conducted surveillance on the property as far back as January 11th, and specifically requested that neighbors check their camera footage from that date alongside January 31st and the early morning hours of February 1st. Additional surveillance cameras on Nancy's property captured weeks of footage before the kidnapping. Family members, landscapers, pool workers, nothing was flagged as suspicious. None of the footage showed the masked suspect on any day prior to the confirmed visit near the time of her disappearance. Whoever this man is, he either knew where the other cameras were positioned or was disciplined enough to avoid them regardless. He approached only the front door where the Ring camera was, and he knew exactly how to disable it. He had a backpack full of materials. He came prepared. He came more than once. Now we come to the DNA evidence. And before going into the technical details of what that evidence has and has not produced, it is worth stopping for one moment to remember what all of this forensic analysis is actually for. Every swab, every database query, every genealogy trace exists for one reason and one reason only: to find the woman whose pacemaker stopped transmitting at 2:28 in the morning on February 1st. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, without her medication, somewhere. That is what every lab result, every CODIS query, and every genetic genealogy submission is reaching toward. Keep her in the center of what follows, because the technical complexity of what the evidence has produced so far can make it easy to lose sight of the person the evidence is meant to find. A black glove was recovered approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. It appeared visually consistent with the gloves the suspect wore in the doorbell footage. It contained DNA from an unknown male. That DNA was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's national database of more than 19 million known offender profiles. No match returned. Investigators then began the process of genetic genealogy analysis, the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes. But as of confirmed reporting, the glove DNA traced not to a suspect but to a local restaurant employee with no connection to the case. That lead is closed. What remains open is the DNA recovered from inside Nancy's home. Nonos described it in early March as a mixed profile, potentially containing material from several individuals, which makes extracting a clean, usable profile for a single person significantly more difficult. Some of that DNA has been submitted to the national database with no resulting hit. Nanos called it a viable lead that will take more time. Genetic genealogy analyst Cease Moore, one of the professionals who helped crack the Golden State Killer case, has said publicly that a second location, a new piece of physical evidence recovered from a different site, could unlock a DNA breakthrough in this investigation. That second location has not been found. A vehicle was captured on Ring camera footage approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home at 2:36 in the morning on February 1st, 8 minutes after the pacemaker signal dropped. Investigators have not been able to identify that vehicle. The sheriff told NBC they are looking at it alongside hundreds of thousands of other vehicles that were out driving at that time of morning. There is a tip that emerged in the days before this recording that deserves specific mention because it illustrates the complexity of what investigators are managing. A tipster contacted media outlets claiming to have seen Nancy Guthrie alive in Sonora, Mexico, the large Mexican state that shares a border with Arizona. The same tipster then contradicted that claim, suggesting in a subsequent communication that Nancy may no longer be alive. The contradictory information from a single source, potentially sent to complicate or redirect the investigation, is exactly the kind of noise that investigators in a high-profile case must sift through alongside genuine leads. The family has offered $1 million. The FBI has separately offered $100,000. The combined reward of $1.2 million has produced no confirmed, actionable leads as of the date of this recording. What the documented research literature tells us about where this investigation stands is important, because it provides a framework for understanding not just the facts of this case, but the conditions under which those facts have been processed. In 2006, law professors Keith Findley and Michael Scott of the University of Wisconsin published a paper titled The Multiple Dimensions of Tunnel Vision in Criminal Cases, which became one of the most cited documents in American criminal justice reform, subsequently referenced by the Innocence Project, the Canadian Department of Justice, and criminal reform bodies across multiple countries. Their central finding was not that tunnel vision is the product of corrupt or careless investigators. It is, they documented, a natural cognitive tendency present in all human beings, including experienced forensic professionals, that becomes acutely dangerous in criminal investigation environments because of the irreversibility of the decisions being made. Findley and Scott identified 3 mechanisms that drive it simultaneously. Confirmation bias, which causes people to interpret new information in ways that align with existing belief. Hindsight bias, which makes past decisions appear more obviously correct than they were. And outcome bias, which causes people to evaluate the quality of a decision based on how it turned out rather than on the quality of the process that produced it. Together, these mechanisms cause investigators to build a model of what happened and then filter all incoming evidence through that model, amplifying information that confirms it and discounting information that doesn't. The research confirmed this applies not only to detectives and prosecutors but to forensic scientists, examiners who received prior framing about a case before examining physical evidence changed their interpretations in ways consistent with the framing they had received. The National Academy of Sciences flagged the same finding in a 2009 review of forensic disciplines. The Innocence Project found tunnel vision as a thread running through virtually every one of the 170 post-conviction DNA exonerations it documented, not as the sole cause of wrongful convictions, but as the environment in which individual failures were able to persist long past the point where they should have been caught. Now consider the specific conditions of this investigation against that framework. Law enforcement arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home after the family had already been there for up to an hour. Their first description of the crime scene came from people who had already processed it emotionally and physically. The ransom theory was named by a family member before any note arrived and was reinforced through the family's public statements before the FBI had validated a single communication. The family became the primary public voice on which notes were real and which were from opportunists. The crime scene was described as corrupted by the former sheriff who ran this same department. Evidence was sent to a private Florida lab instead of the FBI for cost reasons in a case where federal forensic services are free. The lead detective's oversight was bypassed when the sheriff personally announced the reopening of the scene on television. The investigative team had no prior homicide experience. The deputies representing the department voted unanimously to remove their own sheriff. The Board of Supervisors moved to compel testimony under oath. And 66 days in, there is no arrest, no named suspect, and no public explanation for why investigators believe this specific house, in this specific neighborhood, was targeted for one of the most operationally sophisticated abductions in recent Arizona history. The question that the documented research literature recommends for every high-profile case in this condition is whether a formal, structured case review has been conducted, an independent examination of the dominant theory, performed deliberately by someone outside the framework that was established in the first hours, not to implicate the family, not to contradict the forensic evidence, but to ensure that the narrative introduced in those first critical hours, the doors, the blood, the ransom framing, has been independently stress-tested rather than simply confirmed by evidence gathered within its own assumptions. That protocol has been adopted as formal policy in countries that have reckoned with the consequences of tunnel vision. Canada recommended it after reviewing wrongful convictions nationally. The Netherlands built an investigative reform program around it. The Innocence Project advocates for it in every case where public pressure and early narrative framing are both present. Whether that review has been conducted in the Nancy Guthrie investigation has not been answered publicly. What has been stated publicly is that Nanos told NBC he believes investigators know why the home was targeted, that the attack was targeted and deliberate, but that he cannot confirm it with 100% certainty. He did not rule out the possibility that the same perpetrator could strike again. He said there is information in this case he cannot share without compromising the investigation. A sitting sheriff who simultaneously faces a no-confidence vote from his own deputies, a board-compelled deposition, a recall effort, a public accusation of crime scene corruption from a former United States Surgeon General who ran his same department, and persistent documented questions about his investigative team's experiences managing all of those crises while claiming the investigation is progressing toward a conclusion he cannot yet describe. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is now in its 10th week. Her pacemaker disconnected at 2:28 in the morning. That time stamp exists independently of every account given since, independently of every press conference, every Instagram video, every ransom note, every institutional crisis surrounding the agency charged with finding her. It tells investigators when she was taken. It anchors the entire window. And 66 days after that signal dropped, the man who carried a backpack to her front door more than once, who knew where the cameras were, who disabled the Ring device with his bare hands, who walked out of frame and into a night in Tucson that has not yet given him back, is still out there. Nancy Guthrie deserves an investigation that can produce a conviction. Her family deserves answers that will survive the challenges a defense attorney will bring to every piece of evidence in a compromised scene. And the documented record, the crime scene integrity questions, the institutional collapse of the lead agency, the forensic anomalies that have not produced a name. Those facts are not arguments against finding her. They are arguments for finding her the right way before it is too late to build the case that holds. If this investigation is one you have been following with the precision and commitment it demands, hit the like button right now and subscribe. We are tracking every development as it emerges, every update to the DNA evidence, every move in the proceeding against Sheriff Nonos, and every tip or sighting that surfaces. Drop a comment and tell me, given everything in this documented record, what do you believe is the single most critical unanswered question that investigators need to answer before they can make this arrest? And share this with someone who has only been following the surface coverage. Because 66 days in, the surface is not where the real story lives.